Welcome to Exponential Church's online experience. We are back to our live in-person services, and we want to invite you to join us every Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m. We meet at Renaissance Charter School in Tradition, located at 10900 Tradition Parkway here in Port St. Lucie, Florida. It's super easy to find us. Just drive west all the way to the end of Tradition Parkway, and you can't miss us. We are at the end of the road on the left. But we understand that some people are not ready for the large gathering type setting yet. So that's why we are continuing with these online experiences. This is a condensed version of what a Sunday morning-like experience would look like at Expo. But it is the same sermon that Pastor Steve is going to be preaching to those who are gathering for the live services. So you're not missing out on that. If you don't want to feel alone watching the message today, just smash that like button on this video and then share it with your friends on social media. Or if you're watching on YouTube, copy the link and text it to your friends and family. You never know, this could be a life-changing message to someone you know. So without further ado, let's open God's Word and worship Him this morning.
Happy Father's Day out there to all the dads, and just want to say a special Happy Father's Day to my dad. Dad, I just love you so much, and just thank you for being such an amazing example of what a godly dad should be. And I love you. Wish I could be with you today and give you a big old hug. Listen, just as it was for Mother's Day, I do recognize that this day is not always the best for some people. Some people have different emotions about this day, and maybe the absence of a father, or maybe just not a good father, whatever it might be. But listen, I just want you to know that I am sorry if that is you today. My heart just goes out to you. Also, as with Mother's Day, I'm not going to preach a Father's Day specific message, but I do think the men listening today are going to find today's message enjoyable. As we continue in our marriage series, Till Death Do Us Part, I want to talk to you today about having invincible intimacy in your marriages. That's right. I want to talk to you about sex on Father's Day. Men, you're welcome. Look, on the whole, human beings are fascinated with sex. Men and women, young and old, Christians, atheists, and everybody in between. In all cultures, throughout all of history, the sexual desire has been one of the greatest motivators of human will. We've seen and heard of men and women who have thrown away their families and houses and money and land even to be sexually satisfied. Some are addicted to it. Wars have been fought over it. We compose songs about it, make movies about it, and write stories about it. And this preoccupation with sex is not simply a facet of our fallen nature. Did you know that there is a whole book of the Bible that is dedicated to celebrating sexual relationship between the husband and wife? Now some of you are starting to think, I need to read the Bible more, right? That's the Old Testament book called the Song of Solomon. That's what it's all about. But have you ever wondered why all the fuss? Why did God create us as sexual people in the first place? He's obviously not tied to a need for sexual reproduction in order to populate the earth. I mean, he created Adam and Eve without that. He just as easily could have created humans as asexual creatures that reproduce like amoebas. It's when we understand why God created sex that we really begin to make sense of His commandments regarding sexual purity. This is because God's commands always relate to His purposes. A few weeks ago, we looked at the passage Ephesians chapter 5, and we read verses 31 and 32 that said this: Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. From these words in Ephesians, we can see that when a man and a woman come together sexually, in some mysterious way, they become one flesh. Something profound occurs through sexual intercourse. The marriage union is not simply a legal union or a social union or a financial union or a familial union, but rather is a union of bodies, a sharing of physical life. Through sex, two people are joined together in the deepest and most wonderful way, so much so that they are said to become one. This is why sexual intercourse is rightly said to consummate a marriage. Now, marriage is more than sex, but it's not less than sex either. In fact, in the ancient biblical world, sexual union was the primary means by which a man and a woman married each other. Unlike today, religious clergy of the ancient world did not create a marriage through a formal pronouncement. It was actually the act of sex itself that created the marriage. And this is why a healthy marriage relationship is the living out of that union that is established through sexual intercourse. Making our marriages work, though, involves learning how we relate as male and female as sexual beings. So today we're going to consider God's design and desire for sexual intimacy to build an invincible intimacy within our marriage. Now listen, I know that sex is a topic that can often stir plenty of interest. I mean, when I first mentioned sex a few moments ago, the likes on this video, went up a lot. But I also know that this can tend to be a sensitive subject. It's about something that's very personal and very intimate. In a culture that wants to turn sexuality into a source of public commodity and consumption, something still feels very personal and intimate about it. So I certainly want to respect and protect that personal nature and the sensitivity today as we navigate through this. We do, however, live in a time that prides itself on being sexually free. Yet the reality is that we are still sexually conflicted. It's been said that what a culture tries to laugh at is what is most unresolved within it. Our comedy is obsessed with sex because there is so much tension unresolved within us about it. Our feelings about being sexual can explicit a mix of goodness and guilt and beauty and shame. Sexuality is such a deep part of our identity and a deep part of our insecurity. We live in this sexual tension marked by both repression and obsession, inhibition and indulgence. But listen, the only one not hung up in sexual confusion is God himself. God is the one who created us as sexual beings. So today, let's look at God's word to see what it says about sex. The first thing I want you to see today is that our sexuality is rooted in the divine nature of God. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26, 27, and 28, it says this: Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let him have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the seas and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth." If you jumped into Genesis chapter number 2 and look at verse 24 and 25, it says this: "Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed." Here in these passages, we are reminded of the fact that God created sexuality and the potential for sexual intimacy. I mean, it's not like, God created the first humans and then he went on lunch break and then he came back and he was like, "Whoa, what are they doing? Who taught them how to do that?" That wasn't how it happened. The original state was his idea, and how different it is from what we often feel. That last verse that we read there, Genesis chapter 2, verse 25, it said, the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. Can you imagine that? A nakedness of body that had nothing to hide from God or anyone. No shame. No shame from their past, and no shame that comes from falling short of some expectations for performance. The truth is, our sexuality is rooted in God, and it's reflected in several ways. One is reflected in our complementary nature. He says that we are created male and female. We are uniquely created as male and female to reflect the complementary aspects of God's character. It's helpful to ask what God says about when they become sexual beings. When did they become male and female? Was it when they left and joined partners? No. Was it when they united and created life? No. At the very moment they were created, they were either male or female. And that speaks to a valuable truth for us today. You will never become more fundamentally a man or a woman than you already are. Now, understand how deeply conflicted some are with being called male or female. Some physical and some psychological in this situation. I believe that it is a conflict that is deep because it is something real. And our biological nature as male and female is not something that we can escape, but it is something that we have to navigate. Another way our sexuality is rooted in God and reflected is in our creative potential. He said they're to be fruitful and multiply. Adam and Eve were told to be fruitful and multiply as their physical union could create new life. Think about this. God, who is the creator, endows us with creative power, including the ability to create life. This is just another way that we are made in his image. Look, sexual intimacy is not reduced to the power and purpose of creating life, but neither can it be understood outside of that sacred power. And one more way that our sexuality is rooted in God and reflected is in our covenant partnerships. It says that we would leave our father and mother. We would become united. We would become one flesh with our partner, with our spouse. God describes that we were given a purpose and a means to partner in fulfilling that purpose. We were created as complementary beings, able to create life, and therefore a man will leave his initial family to create a new union. And this partnership is the essence of marriage. Now, I know that some question the nature of marriage today. So some might even argue that there were many forms of marriage in the Bible. We'll talk about that in a little bit. The ancients would practice polygamy, in which a man he might have many wives. There were obligations to provide for the lineage of a brother who dies by taking his wife as your own. The ancient cultures had some patterns that may seem strange, and in light of what God's original design of an individual man joining an individual woman. But the truth is that as God began to form a people, the understanding of marriage turns back to this original design of a man leaving his father and his mother, cleaving or holding fast to, becoming bound to one woman, and becoming one flesh, uniting in a sacred intimacy only with her. What is described is how the becoming one flesh, the physical union, consummates the commitment. You see, when two become one, then they experience oneness in a sexual union. This helps us to begin to understand how sexual oneness is designed for marriage, where the bonds of oneness have been established, if you will. I realize that within our current culture, we've been trying to negate this idea. The so-called sexual revolution may have rightfully challenged the unhealthy repression of sexual desires, but in trying to ignore that sexual intimacy is that which unites us, it has actually torn apart what was not designed to be separated. Experiencing oneness without being one actually violates our purpose. I understand that that might be hard for some to accept. And you may not even agree at this point. And I don't have time today to get into all of it. But I would suggest that the truth of our sexual nature speaks from both within us and from around us. The physical and personal were not meant to be separated. Freedom is found when body and being are united, when experiencing oneness is bound within the bonds of oneness. You see, sexual intimacy is designed to unite us. Tim Keller describes it this way. He says, sex is a way to say to somebody else, I belong completely and exclusively to you. And if you use it to say anything else, it is a lie. It's a nonverbal piece of communication God designed, and it's meant to carry a message. God said sex is a way to give yourself totally to somebody else and to say, I belong completely and totally and exclusively to you. The simple truth is that no little girl dreams of the day when she's going to find herself in the arms of a stranger. No little boy dreams of the day when they're going to be addicted and consumed with pornography. At our core, we were not designed for such a separation of body and soul. Our culture has invested more into the promotion of casual sex than any other idea that I can even think of. We simply have to decide, is it really a progressive idea though? Or is it a regressive idea? Do I really believe that becoming like an animal in my sexuality, where I could just go and have sex with anyone, anywhere, anytime, is that really the fulfillment of my persona? I don't think that anybody truly believes that to their core. Our current culture desires to try to separate the pleasure from personal commitment. And it's not because we don't feel the connection. It's not because the facts regarding the social cost aren't clear. It's because we have found it hard. Self-control is hard. And it's hard when there is such a long period between when the sexual desires start at puberty within a young kid, and then when we finally get married, which is years, decades, if you will, from that first start feeling of the sexual desires. And so it's hard for us. And it's this tension that Paul addresses in his letter to the Corinthians, where I want us to kind of camp out for the rest of today. Paul is writing to the Corinthians, these people who are living in Greece, the city of Corinth. And here's what he says in 1 Corinthians chapter number 7. I want you to look at the first 7 verses with me and see what he says. It says, now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. Paul's words here, they may not sound like the greatest promotion of marriage. In fact, the wording of other translations can even, sound like it's more like a resignation, if you will, as if to say, well, I mean, if you must get married, okay, it's as if Paul merely just resigns marriage as a necessity for the less controlled in this world, and that just doesn't quite have that Valentine's Day card feel to it, does it? But what Paul is revealing to us here is the second thing I want you to see today. Is God's desire for sexual intimacy in marriage. That first verse there in 1 Corinthians 7 helps us understand what Paul's intent is here. He begins by saying, now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. While Paul certainly has reasons to see the benefits of celibacy, we need to understand that he is beginning to address particular issues and questions that were raised by the Corinthians. To really understand the question, we need to remember the philosophy that was pervading the culture in this time. You see, Paul, he writes extensively about sex to the Corinthians living in Corinth because they were living in a sex-crazed society, kind of much like we are today. Corinth, the city to which he was writing, it was a part of Greece, and it was just 40 miles from Athens. In this part of the world, in this time, they worshipped the goddess Aphrodite. She was the love goddess. And they worshipped her by engaging in sex with temple prostitutes. Even their views on marriage were twisted. Corinthian society recognized 4 types of marriages. First, they recognized a tent companionship. This is where 2 slaves could choose to live as husband and wife. Many Christians were in this position. Then there was common law marriage. Much like today, a couple was considered legally married after an extended time of cohabitation. Then there was a sales transaction marriage. That meant that a bride was purchased, if you will. And then there was the full ceremony, the traditional, if you will, weddings. That included the vows and the rings and the veil and all those things. So with all these types of marriages, it was not uncommon for someone to marry 20 times or more. So when Paul taught this church about the Christian view of sexuality, they wrote back saying, man, you don't know where we live. and what was happening was that there were 2 groups within the church here in Corinth, each representing an extreme side of this topic. You see, one group was really loose and said that they could do whatever they wanted to do with their bodies because sex doesn't really touch us on a spiritual level. It's just kind of my body, my choice. Sound familiar? Type of a thing. And you can read how Paul dealt with them in chapter 6, verses like 12 down to verse 20. You can read how Paul addresses that group of people. The second group went to the other extreme. And they believed that sex was so unspiritual that Christians should never be involved even in marriage. And Paul responds to this group here in chapter number 7. What we see from this is Satan's great strategy when it comes to sex. He is doing everything that he can do to encourage sex outside of marriage and to discourage sex within marriage. And it's an equal victory for Satan if he can accomplish either. So Paul wants to make it clear in his letter. Physical intimacy in marriage is good. That may sound like the most obvious statement ever made, but I actually believe that part of us may even wonder that. But we really need to know that sexual intimacy in marriage is a good thing. And not just a good thing, but a God thing. Whatever feels awkward in connecting God with our sexual pleasure is a reflection of something corrupted. Stop letting sexuality become defined as something bad in and of itself. That's kind of the twist that we have, is that sex is bad and sex is secretive and we shouldn't talk about it and we shouldn't talk about it even with our wives and those types of things. But Paul is not saying that sex is the only reason for marriage or the most important reason for marriage. Paul is simply confronting their negating of sex within marriage here. Our feelings about sex today, including sexual intimacy in marriage, are often still caught between obsession and repression. And Paul is reminding us that neither the indulgent nor the inhibited are really enjoying true sexual freedom. Paul concludes saying he himself embraces his circumstances of being unmarried. He was almost certainly probably married earlier in his life, but he's probably at this point, he's been widowed now. And now he values the freedom to serve God's work with the freedom that this gives him. That affirms that marriage is not an end in itself. There is a larger purpose. He knows that sexual intimacy is not essential to life, but it is powerful and cannot be negated or neglected. So his advice is pretty simple to us. Number 1, he says, experience sex only with your spouse. Paul writes there in verse number 2, he says, because of the temptation to sexual immorality. It's good for a man to have a wife and for a woman to have a husband. We live in a world where sexual drives are strong, but marriage is strong enough to contain them and provide for a balanced and fulfilling sexual life in a world of sexual disorder. I truly believe that. So Paul is saying sex only within marriage. In a world that directs us away from relational intimacy, God calls the heart back home here. This wisdom is the wisdom that we read in the book of Proverbs, chapter 5. Look there, beginning in verse 15. It says, drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets? Let them be for yourself alone and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth, a lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breasts fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. Number 2, Paul's advice. Satisfy your spouse's sexual needs. Look there at verses 3 and 4 again. It says the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Basically, what's being stated here is that the marriage bed must be a place of mutuality. The husband seeking to satisfy his wife, and the wife seeking to satisfy her husband. Look, marriage is not a place to stand up for your rights, so to say. Marriage is a decision to serve the other person. Both the husband and the wife have a marital duty to each other. And in this context, that marital duty is sex. Paul is saying that you are to satisfy your spouse's sexual needs. Paul says that we should not be depriving each other of what our bodies offer each other. What he's referring to is the powerful desire he had just described. In this moment, he's not speaking about sex for the purpose of creating children, but for the pleasure of sex itself. Yes, women, listen, you are to enjoy sex too. Men, as much as you think that sex is for you, your spouse should enjoy it as well. And it is your marital duty to make sure that she is satisfied just as much as it is her duty to you. Oftentimes as Christians, we may become comfortable acknowledging that physical intimacy is good, but perhaps a bit awkward with thinking that God really intended such pleasure from it. Paul not only affirms, but he even calls for both husbands and wives to satisfy one another. Yes, it is a sacred means for being co-creators of life, but there is also a dimension of pleasure to sex, of satisfying the natural sensual desires that men and women have. In the book, there's the Song of Songs, Song of Solomon. We hear of a very sensual love. It's a love story that shows marital sex to be erotic and personal, romantic and fun and passionate and patient. And some of you are thinking, I have really got to start reading my Bible more, right? I got to find this book and go read it. But listen, as God's gift to the intimacy between husband and wife, physical intimacy should be valued and enjoyed on a regular basis. Now look, all of these adjectives will vary in some degree. Will our value always be the same? No, but we can still share in valuing it. Will the level of enjoyment always be the same? No, but enjoyment can always be a part of it. And what is regular, you know? Listen, I'd say the couples may be different on their drives and their desires, but this should be communicated between partners so that there's no frustration in this area of regular or not. So the question then is, how can we develop such a sexually healthy marriage? Well, let me give you some quick points here, okay? 5 of them to be exact. Number 1, understand each other. Listen, men are sight-oriented and women are feelings-oriented. Men, listen, flirt with your wife. Connect with her on a deeper level. Be romantic. Make her feel loved and appreciated. Women, surprise your man. Be creative. Play to his sight-oriented mindset and enjoy the intimacy with him. Number 2, make your sexual relationship strong, leaving no reason for straying. Again, that plays back into that regular basis scenario there. Make it strong so that there's no reason why your spouse would be seeking sexual intimacy with somebody else, somewhere else, with anything else, right? Number 3, avoid long periods of time without having sex. Again, this all goes back to that regular basis and not leaving any area to stray. Again, refer back to verse number 5 there and what it says. Number 4, be intentional about your sexual relationship with each other. And number 5, take seriously the vow that probably most everybody made at their wedding, to forsake all others. Listen, avoid putting yourself in a situation that will lead you to stray. Which brings us to another one of Paul's advice. Guard your relationship from the tensions and the temptations which will seek to threaten it. The end there of verse number 5, it says, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Paul says we need to realize realize there is that which is set against us. He warns us there is a spiritual force who sees marriage as a symbol of God's covenant love on earth. It's an example to the world, and Satan wants to tear it up. He wants to completely destroy it. And Satan will do whatever he can to try to draw every married life away from its center. Author Bruce Wilkinson, he wrote the book called The Prayer of Jabez. Maybe you've read that book. But in a devotional book that he contributed to called Victory Over Temptation, he said this. He said, sexual immorality is a threshold sin. On one side of the threshold is immorality, and on the other is purity. On the one side are guilt, lying, deceit, addiction, and shame. And on the other side are freedom, honesty, transparency, liberty, and a clear conscience. Believers who are in bondage to immorality find that unless they experience victory in this area, they cannot grow in holiness to serve the Lord with passion and power. Strong words there. In chapter 6 there of 1 Corinthians, when he's addressing those who thought that they could just do whatever they wanted with their bodies, this is what he said in verse 18. He said, flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. This literally means, when it says to flee, it literally means to run away from it and to keep on running. Don't let Satan win. Run from it and run to God. Look, when it comes down to it, our marriages are more than sex, but they're not less than sex either. And because of that, a healthy marriage relationship, it's the living out of this union that's established through sexual intercourse. This is why sexual relationship that occurs outside the context of a marriage relationship is so emotionally destructive. The act of sex, which is meant to initiate and sustain a permanent union of marriage, is broken apart and divorced from its very purpose. But herein lies the greatest significance of sex. Not what it accomplishes on an earthly aspect, but what it images on a divine aspect. Sex is not an end in itself. It points to a deeper reality of the gospel. Again, going back to that Ephesians 5 passage that we looked at the beginning today. Look at what Paul said after talking about husband and wife becoming one flesh, there in verse 32. He said, this mystery is profound, and I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. Just as the sacrifice of that Passover lamb in the Old Testament, just as that foreshadowed Christ's atoning sacrifice in the New Testament, so too does the physical oneness established through sex foreshadows the spiritual oneness that will exist, and really already does exist, between Christ and his church at the wedding supper of the Lamb. Our world has completely diminished God's divine design for sex. God's design for sex as a means of procreation, pleasure, and intimacy within marriage is often dismissed. In a culture that has often reduced sex to a cold, mechanical, routine act engaged by virtual strangers. The lure of the quick fix, the one-night stand type of intimacy has replaced the deep satisfaction and the true fulfillment between a man and a woman found within the context of marriage. it is imperative that we understand sex as God designed it. Thankfully, the Bible speaks candidly about sex as something that God created to be incredible. And when we operate within His design, sex becomes all that it was intended to be. It becomes an invincible intimacy, and it helps our marriages last until death do us part.
Thank you for joining us for our online experience. If you gave your life to Jesus today, or if you have any more questions, please feel free to email me and I'll get back with you as soon as possible. If you'd like to invest in the ministry of Expo Church, you can do that from anywhere, as you have two easy options. You can text the dollar amount to the number 84321 and follow the instructions to give that way. Or you can go to our website, expochurch.com, find our giving tab, and follow those instructions. I want to thank those of you who chose to be faithful in your giving to this ministry, and I want you to know that your generosity is helping meet the needs of those in our community, as well as reaching people across the world through our global giving to missionaries around the world. Thank you again for joining us today, and we hope you have a fantastic week.